At 64, I discovered that some people see kindness as weakness and generosity as an invitation to take everything you have. That realization hit me like a slap when my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "Your mother can sleep in the shed." She delivered those words with such casual cruelty, as if I were nothing more than an unwanted piece of furniture to be stored out of sight. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I held the deed to the very property she was trying to banish me from. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who've forgotten that quiet strength runs deeper than loud arrogance. And sometimes the best lessons in respect come from those who thought they held all the power, only to discover they never had any at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Campbell, and if you had told me 3 years ago that I'd be sitting in my lawyer's office planning to evict my own son and his wife, I would have laughed at the impossibility of it all. But here I am, 64 years old, with silver hair that I've finally stopped dyeing, and a backbone that took me 6 decades to fully discover. I spent 37 years as a high school English teacher in the small coastal town of Mendocino, California. Not the glamorous part where celebrities build their weekend retreats, but the working-class section where fishing families have lived for generations, and everyone knows everyone else's business. I taught Shakespeare to teenagers who thought Romeo and Juliet was boring, guided countless students through college application essays, and somehow managed to save enough money to buy a modest 3-bedroom house on Cypress Street when the market was still reasonable. The house isn't anything fancy, built in 1978 with wood siding that needs repainting every few years, and a small front yard dominated by an ancient oak tree that drops leaves faster than I can rake them. But it sits on a corner lot in a neighborhood that's been quietly appreciating in value as Bay Area refugees discover our little town. The back garden stretches wider than most properties on the street, with enough space for a vegetable garden, a storage shed, and even a small guest cottage that the previous owner had built for his aging mother. When I bought the house in 2009, I was a newly divorced woman starting over at 50. My ex-husband had taken most of our savings in the settlement, claiming he needed it to establish his new life with his secretary-turned-second wife. I used what remained of my teacher's pension fund as a down payment and spent the next 15 years making every mortgage payment on time, even during the summers when my teaching salary stopped. My son Andrew grew up in this house after the divorce. He was 17 then, angry about his parents splitting up, and even angrier about having to leave his friends in Sacramento. But gradually, Mendocino grew on him. He learned to surf at the local beach, found his first job at the hardware store, downtown, and even met his future wife at the annual Mendocino Music Festival 3 years ago. That's where Scarlett came into our lives. Scarlett Thomas was 26 when Andrew introduced her to me, 15 years younger than my son, and absolutely stunning in that effortless way some women possess. Long auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, green eyes that seemed to sparkle with perpetual amusement, and a smile that could charm birds from trees. She worked as a social media manager for a boutique winery in nearby Anderson Valley, constantly taking photos of wine tastings and sunset vineyard views for their Instagram account. From the beginning, I wanted to like her. Andrew was 41 and had never brought anyone home who made him light up the way Scarlett did. He'd had a few serious relationships over the years, but nothing that seemed to stick. Watching him with Scarlett, seeing how animated he became when talking about their weekend trips to San Francisco or their plans to visit wine country, I felt hopeful that he'd finally found his person. Scarlett was charming, I'll give her that. She complimented my cooking, admired the garden, and always remembered to ask about my book club or my volunteer work at the local animal shelter. She had this way of making every conversation feel like she was genuinely interested in what you had to say, tilting her head slightly and maintaining just the right amount of eye contact. "Elena," she'd say in that warm, slightly breathless voice of hers. You have such interesting stories from your teaching years. Have you ever thought about writing them down? Or, this house has such character. I can just picture all the memories you've made here. Looking back now, I recognize these comments for what they were: reconnaissance disguised as compliments. But at the time, I was simply grateful that my son had found someone who seemed to appreciate both him and the life I'd built. They got engaged after dating for 8 months, and Scarlett immediately began planning what she called their dream wedding. Nothing too elaborate, she assured me. Just a small ceremony in the vineyard where she worked, followed by a reception at one of the nicer restaurants in town. The budget grew from $5,000 to $15,000 to $25,000 as Scarlett's vision expanded to include a professional photographer, a live band, upgraded catering, and what she termed the perfect dress. Andrew worked as an insurance adjuster, making decent money but not enough to fund Scarlett's increasingly expensive dreams. That's when the conversations began. "Elena," Scarlett said one evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset, "Andrew and I have been talking about our future, and we're wondering if you might consider letting us move in here after the wedding, just temporarily, while we save up for our own place." She explained it so reasonably. The rental market in Mendocino was brutal, with most decent places going for twice what they could afford. They could save money, help me with house maintenance, and I'd have company in my retirement years. It seemed like a win-win situation. "We'd pay you rent, of course," she added quickly, "and I'd love to help with the cooking and cleaning. This house is so charming, but it's probably a lot for one person to maintain." The suggestion contained just enough concern for my well-being to feel caring rather than opportunistic. I was approaching retirement, and the thought of having family close by was appealing. The house would certainly feel less empty with other people in it. So I said yes. Looking back, that was the moment I signed my own eviction notice from the life I'd built. But I didn't know that then. All I knew was that my son seemed happy, his fiancée seemed lovely, and the prospect of sharing my home with family felt like a blessing, rather than the slow-motion disaster it would become. I had no idea that Scarlett's vision of temporarily staying in my house involved plans that stretched far beyond saving money for their own place. I couldn't have imagined that her interest in my home's character was actually an assessment of its potential value. And I certainly never suspected that her questions about my future plans were really investigations into how long I might be an obstacle to ownership. But that would all become clear soon enough. For now, I was just a mother looking forward to sharing her home with the next generation, blissfully unaware that some people view generosity not as kindness, but as weakness to be exploited. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, in 2022, with golden sunlight filtering through the vineyard where Scarlett worked. She looked absolutely radiant in her designer gown, a dress that had somehow cost $3,000 despite her earlier promises of keeping things simple. Andrew couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle between the grape vines, and I felt my heart swell with genuine happiness for them both. I had contributed $5,000 toward the wedding expenses, telling myself it was an investment in my son's happiness. When Scarlett's parents explained they couldn't help financially, her father had been laid off from his job at a lumber mill, and her mother worked part-time at a grocery store, I didn't hesitate to step in. After all, this was my only son's wedding, and I wanted it to be everything he dreamed of. "Elena, you're such a blessing," Scarlett's mother, Delilah Edwards, told me at the reception. "I don't know what we would have done without your generosity. Scarlett's always dreamed of a wedding like this." The reception was beautiful, I'll admit. Scarlett had an eye for aesthetics, and every detail was Instagram perfect. String lights draped between oak trees, mason jars filled with wildflowers, and a local band that played everything from classic rock to current pop hits. I watched my son dance with his new wife and felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. 2 weeks after they returned from their honeymoon in Napa Valley, another expense that had somehow stretched beyond their original budget. The newlyweds moved into my house. We had agreed they would take the master bedroom, since it was the largest and had its own bathroom. I moved my things into what had been Andrew's childhood room, telling myself the adjustment would be temporary. For the first few months, our arrangement felt almost idyllic. Scarlett was true to her word about helping with household tasks. She took over most of the cooking, experimenting with elaborate recipes she found on Pinterest, and turning our simple meals into what she called dining experiences. She filled the house with fresh flowers, bought throw pillows and decorative candles that made everything look like a home design magazine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I just want to make this place feel special for all of us," she would say, rearranging furniture or hanging new artwork she'd picked up at local galleries. "A home should reflect the people who live in it, don't you think?" Andrew seemed happier than I'd ever seen him. He would come home from work with stories about how his colleagues envied his gorgeous wife and perfect home situation. Scarlett would greet him at the door with a kiss and a glass of wine, asking about his day while dinner simmered on the stove. I found myself enjoying the company more than I'd expected. After living alone for so many years, having voices in the house and someone to share meals with felt like a gift. Scarlett would curl up on the couch beside me in the evenings, asking questions about my teaching career or my memories of Andrew's childhood. "What was he like as a little boy?" she'd ask, tucking her feet under her like a curious daughter. "I bet he was such a sweet kid." I'd tell her stories about Andrew's Little League games, his science fair projects, his first attempts at cooking pancakes that ended up burned and inedible. Scarlett would laugh at all the right moments, her eyes bright with what seemed like genuine affection for the man she'd married. She also showed interest in my past, asking about my marriage, my divorce, my decision to move to Mendocino. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told anyone in years about the loneliness of starting over at 50, the challenges of single parenthood, the satisfaction of building a life entirely on my own terms. "You're such an inspiration, Elena," Scarlett would say. "I hope I have half your strength when I'm your age." Looking back, I realized these conversations served a purpose beyond bonding. Scarlett was learning about my finances, my assets, my plans for the future. She asked seemingly innocent questions about my pension, my savings, whether I'd ever considered downsizing or moving somewhere warmer for retirement. At the time, I interpreted her curiosity as care. Here was a young woman who wanted to understand. Her new family, who was thoughtful enough to ask about my well-being. When she suggested we all go shopping together so she could help me update my wardrobe, I was touched by her interest in my appearance. "You have such classic features, Elena," she said as we browsed through department stores in Santa Rosa. "We just need to find clothes that show off your best qualities." She steered me toward more expensive pieces than I usually bought, explaining, "That quality clothing was actually more economical in the long run." Somehow, what was supposed to be a modest shopping trip turned into a $600 expedition, with Scarlett encouraging me to buy items I wasn't sure I'd ever wear. "Trust me," she said, holding up a cashmere sweater that cost more than I usually spent on clothes in 3 months. "This color is perfect for you, and you deserve to treat yourself. You've worked so hard for so many years." The financial boundaries began blurring in other ways too. When their car needed major repairs, I offered to help with the cost. When Scarlett wanted to take a course in wine marketing to advance her career, I paid the tuition. Small expenses here and there, groceries, utilities, dinner out when they'd had a stressful week. "We'll pay you back," Andrew would say, though somehow the promised repayment never materialized. There was always something else, an unexpected expense, a delayed commission, a plan to pay me back with their tax refund that somehow got redirected to other priorities. I told myself it didn't matter. They were family. They were young and still. getting established, and I could afford to help. Besides, they were contributing to the household in other ways. Scarlett's cooking was certainly better than my simple meals, and she kept the house looking better than it ever had. The first hint of trouble came around month 4, when I walked into the kitchen one morning to find Scarlett on the phone with someone speaking in hushed tones. "No, she's really sweet," I heard her say. "Very accommodating. I think it's going to work out perfectly." She ended the call quickly when she saw me, flashing her usual bright smile. "Good morning, Elena. I was just talking to my sister about how well we're all getting along." But something in her expression, a flicker of calculation I'd never noticed before, made me pause. For just a moment, I wondered who she'd really been talking to, and what exactly was going to work out perfectly. I pushed the thought away. I was probably just being paranoid, reading too much into an innocent conversation. After all, wasn't I lucky to have a daughter-in-law who spoke so positively about our living arrangement? But that tiny seed of doubt had been planted. And over the coming weeks, I would start noticing other small things that didn't quite add up. Other moments when Scarlett's mask seemed to slip just slightly, revealing something underneath that wasn't quite as sweet as the surface suggested. For now, though, I convinced myself I was imagining things. We were a happy family sharing a home, and if some of the financial arrangements seemed a bit one-sided, well, that's what family was for, helping each other through the rough patches until everyone could stand on their own. I had no idea that, in Scarlett's mind, I was never supposed to stand on my own again. The shift happened so gradually that I almost missed it, like watching your hair turn gray. One day you look in the mirror and realize something fundamental has changed, but you can't pinpoint exactly when it started. It began with small comments about my daily routines. I've always been an early riser, up by 6 to enjoy my coffee and morning newspaper in peaceful quiet before the world wakes up. It's been my ritual for decades, a sacred hour of solitude that centers me for the day ahead. "Elena," Scarlett said one morning, appearing in the kitchen in her silk pajamas with a slight frown creasing her otherwise perfect features. "The coffee maker is so loud, it woke me up again." I apologized immediately, suggesting I could wait until later to make coffee. But Scarlett waved her hand dismissively, her smile returning as quickly as it had disappeared. "Oh no, don't change your routine for me. I just thought maybe we could invest in a quieter machine. I saw this amazing one online. It's got all these settings and it's practically silent. Only about $400. $400 for a coffee maker seemed excessive to me, but I found myself nodding along. After all, if my morning routine was disturbing their sleep, wasn't it reasonable to find a compromise? "I'll look into it," I said, and Scarlett's face lit up with that radiant smile that made everyone around her feel like they'd just made her day. The new coffee maker arrived a week later, along with a matching set of ceramic mugs that Scarlett claimed were essential for the full experience. The machine was admittedly quieter, though I privately thought my $20 coffee maker had worked perfectly fine for the past 8 years. Next came my evening television habits. I enjoyed watching the local news at 6, followed by a mystery show or documentary before bed. Nothing loud or disruptive, just quiet entertainment to wind down my day. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me saying this," Scarlett said one evening, perching on the arm of my favorite chair with that concerned expression she'd perfected. "But Andrew and I were hoping to use the living room for some couple time tonight. You know how important it is for newlyweds to have space to connect." The way she said it made me feel selfish for wanting to watch television in my own living room. I immediately retreated to my bedroom, spending the evening reading instead. But I couldn't help noticing that their couple time seemed to involve binge-watching reality shows at volumes considerably louder than my news programs had ever been. This pattern repeated several times a week. I'd settle in to watch something, And Scarlett would appear with that same apologetic but firm expression, explaining how they needed the space for conversations, or how the show I was watching wasn't really conducive to the relaxing atmosphere she was trying to create in the home. I started spending more evenings in my bedroom, telling myself it was temporary, that newlyweds deserved some privacy. But something about being relegated to my own bedroom every night felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The kitchen became another battleground, though Scarlett fought with such sweetness that I barely recognized it as warfare. "Elena, I love that you want to help with cooking," she said one afternoon, gently taking a wooden spoon from my hand as I stirred a pot of soup. "But I've been planning our meals for the week, and this soup doesn't really fit with the menu I've prepared." She'd already taken over most of the cooking, claiming she enjoyed it and wanted to contribute to the household. But now I was learning that my contributions weren't actually welcome unless they aligned with her vision. "I thought maybe you could focus on other ways to help," she continued, her tone bright with false encouragement. "Like maybe organizing the pantry? I noticed it's gotten a bit cluttered, and you have such a good eye for organization. Organizing the pantry in my own kitchen. Like I was a helpful guest rather than the woman who'd been cooking in this space for over a decade. I found myself asking permission for things I'd never questioned before. Could I use the oven if she wasn't planning to cook? Would it be okay if I made a sandwich, or would that interfere with her meal prep? The kitchen began to feel foreign, like I was a visitor who needed to follow someone else's rules. The changes extended to other areas of the house, too. Scarlett had gradually replaced most of my furniture and decorations with items she deemed more cohesive with the overall aesthetic. My comfortable reading chair was moved to the guest bedroom because it didn't flow with the living room's energy. Family photos I'd displayed for years were relocated to less prominent positions, replaced by abstract art prints that Scarlett insisted opened up the space. "I hope you don't mind," she'd say each time, "but I thought this would create better feng shui. You want the house to feel harmonious, don't you?" How could I argue with wanting harmony in my own home? The financial requests became more frequent too, though always presented as temporary solutions to unexpected problems. "Elena, I'm so embarrassed to ask this," Scarlett said one morning, clutching her phone with what appeared to be genuine distress. "But my car insurance premium went up and it's due today. Could you possibly cover it, just until Andrew's commission check comes in next week?" $250 for car insurance seemed high, but I didn't question it. Family helped family, especially when it was clearly a temporary situation. Except Andrew's commission check apparently didn't cover the insurance reimbursement because there was another unexpected expense, a work conference Scarlett needed to attend, professional clothing she required for client meetings, dental work that wasn't fully covered by their insurance. Each request came with detailed explanations, apologetic tones, and promises of repayment that somehow never materialized. But they also came with subtle implications that questioning these requests would make me petty, unsupportive, or worse, selfish. "I know you understand how important it is for us to get established in our careers," Scarlett would say. "You were young once too. You remember how hard it was to get ahead when you're just starting out." The guilt was expertly applied. Here I was, a woman with a paid-off house and a comfortable pension, begrudging help to young people trying to build their future. What kind of mother, what kind of person would I be if I nickel and dimed my own family? But the requests weren't just about money. They were about control, about establishing who had the right to make decisions in this house. "Elena, I've been thinking about the guest cottage out back," Scarlett mentioned casually one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "It's such a shame to let it sit empty. I have a friend who's looking for a place to rent, and the extra income could really help with the household expenses." The guest cottage, where my elderly mother had lived during her final years, where I'd planned to set up an art studio once I fully retired. Scarlett was talking about renting it out like it was the most natural thing in the world, like the decision was hers to make. "I haven't really thought about renting it," I said carefully. "Oh, but it makes so much financial sense," she pressed, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We could probably get $800 a month for it, maybe more. That's almost $10,000 a year just sitting there unused." The way she said "we" made my stomach clench. When had my property become our financial opportunity? I managed to deflect the conversation that night, but I could see the wheels turning in Scarlett's mind. She'd planted the seed, and I knew she'd bring it up again. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom while my son and his wife occupied my master suite, I stared at the ceiling and tried to pinpoint when I'd started feeling like a guest in my own home. When had my preferences become inconveniences? When had my possessions become communal property to be rearranged at will? More troubling still, when had I started needing permission to live my own life? I told myself I was being paranoid, that these were normal adjustments when multiple adults shared a living space. Compromise was healthy, flexibility was mature. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that what I was experiencing wasn't compromise, it was systematic displacement. And the most unsettling part was how expertly it was being done. Scarlett never raised her voice, never made demands. Everything was suggested, requested, framed as mutual benefit or temporary necessity. She was dismantling my authority in my own home with such skill that I almost admired the artistry of it. Almost. By spring, the subtle suggestions had transformed into confident expectations, and I found myself living by rules I'd never agreed to in a house I'd owned for 14 years. The guest cottage situation escalated first. What had started as Scarlett's casual suggestion became a persistent campaign. She began bringing it up at least twice a week, each time with new arguments about why renting it out made perfect sense. "Elena, I did some research," she announced one morning, spreading printed pages across the kitchen table like she was presenting a business proposal. "Similar properties in the area are getting $1,200 a month, not $800 like I originally thought. That's over $14,000 a year." She had researched rental markets, contacted property management companies, even taken photos of the cottage's interior to assess its potential. The level of initiative she'd shown in planning the monetization of my property was both impressive and deeply unsettling. "Look at these listings," she continued, pointing to printouts of similar rentals. "With just a small investment in updates, maybe new paint, some modern fixtures, we could position this as a premium rental. I'm thinking we could call it the Oak Cottage or something charming like that." The casual use of "we" had become constant now. We could rent the cottage. We could upgrade the kitchen. We should consider refinancing the house to take advantage of better interest rates. Every conversation about my property and finances included her as an equal stakeholder. When I hesitated, expressing concerns about having strangers living so close to the main house, Scarlett's tone shifted subtly. "Elena, I understand you're nervous about change," she said, reaching across to pat my hand in a gesture that felt patronizing rather than comforting. "But you have to think practically. You're retired now, living on a fixed income. Wouldn't it be smart to maximize your assets while you're still healthy enough to manage a rental property?" The implication was clear. I was getting older, potentially less capable of making sound financial decisions. She was the young, energetic one with fresh ideas and modern business sense. How fortunate for me that she was here to guide me toward better choices. Besides, she added with that brilliant smile, I'd handle all the logistics, finding tenants, managing the lease, dealing with any issues that come up. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. She'd manage my property, handle my rental income, deal with my tenants. It was my cottage. But somehow she'd positioned herself as the one who would control every aspect of its use. When I still didn't immediately agree, she played her trump card. "Andrew thinks it's a great idea too," she said, though my son had never mentioned the cottage to me directly. "He's excited about the extra income helping with household expenses. You know how hard he works to support us all." The guilt was expertly deployed. Here was my son, working hard to support not just his wife, but also his mother. And I was being selfish by not maximizing our family's financial potential. I agreed to think about it, which Scarlett interpreted as eventual consent. She began referring to the cottage rental as a done deal, mentioning it to neighbors and even posting in local community groups about the upcoming availability of a charming cottage rental in our area. The financial requests had escalated too, both in frequency and amounts. What used to be emergency expenses of a few $100s became regular, temporary loans of $1,000 or more. "Elena, I'm so embarrassed about this," Scarlett said one afternoon, tears actually welling in her eyes. "But there's been a mix-up with my payroll, and my rent portion for this month is going to be late. Could you possibly cover it, and I'll pay you back as soon as the payroll issue is resolved?" Rent portion. She'd been living in my house for 7 months and had never paid a cent of rent, but suddenly there was a rent portion that needed to be covered. "How much?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. $1,500, she said quickly. "I know it's a lot, but that's what our share would be if we were renting a comparable place. $1,500 for living in a house I owned, outright, where the only monthly expenses were utilities and property taxes that totaled less than $400. But the way she presented it made it seem reasonable. After all, shouldn't they be paying something? And if there was a payroll issue, wasn't it family obligation to help? I wrote the check, adding it to the growing mental tally of temporary loans that now exceeded $8,000. The most troubling escalation was in how Scarlett spoke to me, and more importantly, how she spoke about me to others. I overheard her on the phone one afternoon, talking to someone about weekend plans. "We can't do Saturday," she was saying. "I have to take Elena to her doctor's appointment. She's been having some memory issues lately, and Andrew and I are worried about her driving alone." Memory issues. I'd forgotten one appointment and had trouble finding my keys twice in the past month. Normal occurrences for anyone, but in Scarlett's narrative, they became symptoms of cognitive decline that required her supervision. She'd also begun intercepting my mail, claiming she was helping organize my paperwork. Important documents would disappear from my desk, later reappearing in files that Scarlett had created for me. "I just want to make sure nothing important gets lost," she explained when I questioned where my insurance renewal notice had gone. "You have so much paperwork, and some of it is really complex. I thought it would be easier if everything was properly organized. My financial documents, medical records, and legal papers were being organized by someone who wasn't their intended recipient." When I asked to see my own files, Scarlett would bring me what she deemed necessary while keeping the rest safely organized in her system. The social isolation was perhaps the most insidious escalation. My weekly lunch with my book club friends became a source of concern for Scarlett. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me saying this," she said one Tuesday morning as I prepared to leave for our monthly meeting. "But I noticed you seemed a bit confused when you came home last week. Maybe these social outings are becoming too overwhelming?" I hadn't been confused. I'd been tired from a particularly engaging discussion about a complex novel. But in Scarlett's interpretation, intellectual fatigue became evidence of my declining capacity to handle social situations. "Maybe it would be better if you stayed home today," she suggested gently. "I could make you a nice lunch, and we could watch one of those cooking shows you enjoy." The suggestion was made with such apparent care that refusing felt churlish. I called my friends to cancel, making excuses about not feeling well. This pattern repeated with increasing frequency. My volunteer work at the animal shelter became too physically demanding. My weekly grocery shopping became too stressful in crowded stores. One by one, my independent activities were reframed as hazardous to my well-being. "I just worry about you," Scarlett would say, always with that concerned expression that made me feel selfish for wanting to maintain my own routines. "You're so important to our family. We can't risk something happening to you." But the most significant escalation was Scarlett's growing boldness in making decisions about my property without consultation. I came home from one of my increasingly rare outings to find a locksmith's van in my driveway. Scarlett met me at the door with her usual bright smile. "Great news, Elena." I had all the locks changed. That old hardware was so outdated, and the security was really concerning. Andrew and I have been worried about break-ins in the neighborhood. New locks, on my house, installed without my knowledge or consent. "Here are your keys," she said, handing me a single set. I had 3 sets made, one for each of us, much safer than those old locks that probably hadn't been changed in years. 3 sets of keys to my house, one for me, one for Andrew, one for Scarlett, as if we were equal owners rather than me being the sole proprietor hosting 2 guests. But the most chilling part was her next comment, delivered with casual confidence. "I also gave a set to the property management company I've been working with for the cottage rental. They'll need access for showings and maintenance." A property management company had keys to my house, a company I'd never hired, managing a rental I'd never agreed to, now had unlimited access to my property. "Elena, you look upset," Scarlett said, tilting her head with mock concern. "I thought you'd be relieved that we're taking care of these security issues for you. This is what family does. We look out for each other." That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom holding a single key to the house I'd owned for 14 years, listening to my son and his wife discussing their plans for our property through the thin walls. I finally understood what had been happening. This wasn't a series of small boundary crossings or innocent misunderstandings. This was a systematic takeover, executed with such skill that I'd been complicit in my own displacement. Scarlett hadn't moved into my house. She'd moved me out of it, one small concession at a time, until I was living like a dependent relative in my own home. The question now was what I was going to do about it. The end came on a Tuesday in early June, during what should have been a routine conversation about summer plans. I had no idea that within the span of 10 minutes, my entire relationship with my son and his wife would be irrevocably shattered. It started innocently enough. Scarlett was scrolling through her phone, at the kitchen table, making excited noises about something she'd found online. "Elena, look at this," she said, turning her screen toward me. "My sister Ivy found the most amazing deal on a vacation rental in Lake Tahoe. She wants to invite the whole family for a week in July." I glanced at the listing, a sprawling lakefront house that could accommodate 8 people, with a private dock and all the amenities anyone could want for a perfect summer getaway. "It looks lovely," I said, genuinely meaning it. I'd always enjoyed Lake Tahoe, and the thought of a family vacation sounded appealing. "The thing is," Scarlett continued, her tone shifting slightly, "it's pretty expensive even with everyone splitting the cost. About $1,200 for our share of the week?" I waited, sensing there was more coming. Ivy thought it would be perfect timing since her parents are coming to visit anyway. They could stay here and house sit while we're all at the lake, together. Something cold settled in my stomach. "Her parents are coming here?" "Well, yes," Scarlett said, as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. "Ivy's parents love visiting California, and they've been wanting to see the house ever since our wedding. It would be perfect. They get a free place to stay, and we get house sitters who'll take good care of everything." I tried to process what she was suggesting. "So while we're at Lake Tahoe, your sister's parents would be staying in my house?" "Exactly!" Scarlett's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Bruce and Delilah, you remember them from the wedding? They're such responsible people. Bruce used to work in property management, so he'd actually be able to handle any issues that come up with the cottage rental too." The cottage rental, the one I still hadn't formally agreed to, but which Scarlett discussed as established fact. "And here's the best part," she continued, clearly building to what she considered the perfect solution. "Since they'll be house-sitting, we could all go to Tahoe together, even you, Elena." Though, she paused, and something in her expression changed. The bright enthusiasm dimmed, replaced by a look of calculated concern. Though I was thinking, you might be more comfortable staying here. I know travel can be stressful at your age, and you've been so tired lately. Plus, someone should really keep an eye on Bruce and Delilah. Make sure they're settling in okay. I stared at her, trying to understand what I was hearing. You want me to stay home to supervise the house sitters in my own house while you all go on vacation? Not supervise, Scarlett said quickly, her tone taking on that patronizing sweetness I'd grown to despise. Just be here in case they need anything. You know how confusing it can be for older people in a new place. Older people. Bruce and Delilah were probably my age, but somehow in Scarlett's narrative, I was the one who needed to stay behind and play host to strangers in my own home. Besides, she added, the cottage rental guests are supposed to check in that same week. It would be perfect to have you here to handle any questions or issues that come up. Perfect for whom? I thought but didn't say. That's when Andrew walked in from work, immediately sensing the tension in the room. What's going on? He asked, loosening his tie and looking between us. I was just telling Elena about the Tahoe trip, Scarlett said, jumping up to give him a kiss. And explaining how her staying here would actually work out better for everyone. Andrew frowned slightly. Mom's not coming to Tahoe? Well, she could, Scarlett said, but she'd be more comfortable here. Besides, someone needs to be here for the house sitters and the cottage guests. I watched my son's face as he processed this information. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, or recognition that something wasn't right about this arrangement. But then Scarlett stepped closer to him, placing her hand on his arm in that possessive way that had become her signature gesture. You know how your mom gets overwhelmed by too much activity, she said softly, as if I weren't sitting right there. And travel is so exhausting at her age. She'll be happier in her own environment. My own environment. In the house I owned, with strangers house-sitting, while I supervised rental guests in my backyard cottage. I haven't agreed to the cottage. Rental, I said firmly, speaking for the first time since this conversation had taken its bizarre turn. Scarlett's smile faltered for just a moment. Elena, we've talked about this so many times. The rental income will really help with expenses, especially now that we're trying to save for our own place. Their own place. This was the first I'd heard of them saving to move out, and something about the way she said it felt like a threat rather than a promise. I think we should discuss this as a family, I said, looking directly at Andrew. All of these decisions about my house, my property, my plans. That's when Scarlett's mask finally slipped completely. Elena, she said, her voice taking on a sharp edge I'd never heard before. I think you're getting confused about how families work. We live here too. We contribute to this household. We have a right to be involved in decisions that affect all of us. This is my house, I said quietly. Technically, yes, Scarlett replied, and the word technically hit me like a slap. But Andrew is your son. I'm your daughter-in-law. This is our family home now. You can't just make unilateral decisions that affect everyone. Our family home. My house had become our family home, in which I apparently no longer had unilateral decision-making authority. I think, I said, standing up from the table, that I need some time to think about all of this. Of course you do, Scarlett said, her voice dripping with false patience. These kinds of changes can be overwhelming. Why don't you go rest in your room while Andrew and I figure out the logistics? Go rest in my room, like a difficult relative who needed to be managed. But it was what happened next that changed everything. I was walking toward the hallway when I heard Scarlett's voice behind me, speaking to Andrew in what she apparently thought was a whisper, but was loud enough for me to hear clearly. Honestly, Andrew, I don't know how much longer we can handle this. She's getting so difficult about everything. Maybe it's time to start looking into other arrangements. Other arrangements. For me. in my own house. I stopped walking but didn't turn around. What kind of other arrangements? Andrew asked. There was a pause, and then Scarlett's voice, casual as if she were discussing the weather. Well, there's that nice senior community in Ukiah. Or honestly, if she's going to be this stubborn about the cottage rental, maybe she should move out there herself. Your mother can sleep in the shed for all I care, if that's the only way she'll stop interfering with our plans. Your mother can sleep in the shed. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen in the hallway, waiting for Andrew to respond, waiting for my son to defend me, to express shock or outrage at his wife's casual cruelty. Instead, I heard him sigh. Scarlett, you can't say things like that. Like what? She shot back. I'm just being realistic. She's never going to accept that this is our home, too. Maybe it would be better for everyone if she had her own space. Her own space. The shed in the backyard of the house I'd owned for 14 years. I know she's difficult, Andrew said. And those 4 words shattered something inside me that I didn't even know was still whole. But she's still my mother. Still his mother. As if that were some unfortunate technicality rather than the relationship that had defined my adult life. I stood there in my own hallway, listening to my son and his wife discuss my disposal like I was a piece of unwanted furniture. The shed. She thought I should sleep in the shed. What they didn't know, what neither of them had ever bothered to ask or learn, was that I held the deed to every inch of this property. The house, the yard, the shed they thought would be suitable accommodations. For me. All of it was mine, legally and completely. I walked to my bedroom, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. They were shaking, but not with fear or hurt. They were shaking with rage. For over a year, I'd allowed these people to systematically dismantle my life, my autonomy, my dignity. I'd made excuses for their behavior, rationalized their increasing demands, convinced myself that accommodation was the same as love. But there was no rationalizing, your mother can sleep in the shed. There was no accommodating people who saw me as an obstacle to be removed from my own property. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the folder containing my important documents. Property deed, will, financial statements, insurance policies. All of it in my name. All of it under my control. Scarlett thought she held all the power in this situation. She thought she'd successfully positioned herself as the reasonable young woman dealing with a difficult older relative who was too stubborn to accept reality. She had no idea that the reality was about to change completely, and it was going to. Start with a phone call to my lawyer first thing in the morning. The next 2 weeks were the most challenging acting job of my life. Every morning, I woke up and played the role of the accommodating mother-in-law who was thinking over the summer arrangements. I smiled when Scarlett showed me vacation photos on Pinterest. I nodded when she mentioned updates needed for the cottage rental. I even wrote another check when Andrew claimed there was an emergency with his car insurance. But behind the scenes, I was methodically building an unassailable case. Harold had given me a clear list of tasks, and I approached each one with the same systematic precision I'd once used to prepare lesson plans. The difference was that this curriculum was designed to teach my son and his wife a lesson they'd never forget. First, I needed documentation. Harold explained that while I had every legal right to remove them from my property, having evidence of their behavior would make the process smoother and protect me from any claims they might make about my mental competency. I started keeping a detailed journal, recording every financial request, every dismissive comment, every instance of them making decisions about my property without consultation. I noted dates, times, witnesses when possible, and the exact words used. The pattern that emerged was even more damning than I'd realized. In just 2 weeks, I documented 3 separate requests for money totaling 2,107 instances of Scarlett, making appointments or commitments on my behalf without asking. 4 occasions when she intercepted my mail or phone calls, 2 conversations where she discussed my declining abilities with neighbors, multiple references to our property when discussing my house. I also began secretly recording conversations on my phone. California is a 2-party consent state, but Harold had advised me that recordings made in my own home for the purpose of protecting myself from financial abuse fell into a legal gray area that would likely work in my favor. The recordings were revelatory. When Scarlett thought I was out of earshot, she spoke about me with a casual contempt that was breathtaking. I captured her telling Andrew that I was becoming more difficult every day, and that they needed to start making plans for when she can't live independently anymore. She discussed my finances with the familiarity of someone who considered them her own, mentioning my pension amounts and savings balances that she had no business knowing. Most damaging was a conversation I recorded while pretending to nap on the living room couch. Scarlett was on the phone with someone. I later determined it was her sister Ivy, discussing their long-term strategy. "The property is worth at least $600,000 now," I heard her say. "More if we develop the cottage properly. Andrew's name isn't on the deed yet, but once we establish guardianship, that'll be easy to fix." She's already showing signs of confusion, and her doctor's been noting some memory concerns. My doctor had noted no such concerns. I'd had my annual physical just 3 months earlier, and Dr. Martinez had pronounced me in excellent health for my age. But apparently, Scarlett was already building a medical narrative to support her future plans. "The key is patience," she continued. "We can't rush this or it'll look suspicious. But within a year, maybe 18 months, we should be able to petition for conservatorship. Then the property transfer becomes a matter of Andrew looking out for his mother's best interests. Property transfer." They weren't just planning to control my living situation. They were planning to steal my house. While gathering evidence, I also began preparing my finances for their inevitable departure. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, slowly transferring funds to ensure they couldn't claim joint access to my existing accounts. I changed all my passwords and security questions, created new online banking credentials, and set up automatic payments for all my utilities and property taxes. Harold helped me draft a new will, one that very specifically excluded both Andrew and Scarlett from any inheritance. Instead, my assets would go to various charities: the local animal shelter where I'd volunteered, the literacy program where I'd taught adult education classes, and a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. If my son wanted to benefit from my life's work, he could have chosen to treat me with respect while I was alive. I also investigated their claims about needing money. Andrew's supposed car insurance emergency was fabricated. I called his insurance company directly, claiming to be helping him with paperwork, and learned his policy was current and had been paid months in advance. Scarlett's payroll mix-up was equally fictitious. I drove past her workplace one afternoon and saw her car in the parking lot, then watched her leave at her normal time, laughing with coworkers. No one experiencing serious financial stress displays that level of carefree behavior. The cottage rental scheme was the most elaborate deception. I discovered that Scarlett had not only contacted property management companies, but had actually signed a lease agreement with tenants, claiming to be my authorized representative. She'd collected a security deposit and first month's rent totaling $2,400, money that had never been mentioned to me, let alone shared. When I confronted the property management company, pretending to be confused about the arrangement, they showed me Scarlett's forged signature on documents claiming power of attorney over my property. She had literally committed fraud to rent out my cottage without my knowledge. I made copies of everything, then calmly told the company there had been a misunderstanding and that the rental arrangement was unauthorized. The look of panic on the property manager's face told me they understood the legal implications of what Scarlett had done. But the most crucial preparation was emotional. I had to steel myself for the reality that I was about to lose my son forever. Not because I was choosing to abandon him, but because he had already chosen to abandon me in favor of his wife's schemes. I wrote him a letter that I planned to give him after the legal proceedings were complete. In it, I tried to explain how his silence during Scarlett's worst behavior had been more painful than her overt cruelty. How watching him stand by while she systematically dismantled my dignity had broken something in me that could never be repaired. I raised you to be better than this, I wrote. I taught you to stand up for people who couldn't defend themselves, to honor the sacrifices others made for you, to treat your elders with respect. But when it mattered most, when your mother needed you to be the man I'd raised, you chose the easy path of compliance over the difficult path of courage. I sealed the letter and put it with my important documents. Andrew would get it eventually, but not until after he'd learned that actions have consequences and that some betrayals can't be undone with apologies. The final piece of preparation was the hardest. I had to tell my closest friends what was happening. Not everything. I wasn't ready to admit the full extent of my humiliation, but enough so they'd understand why my son and his wife would soon be telling people I was mentally incompetent. I called my book club president, Martha Wilson, and asked her to document our recent conversations about complex novels. I asked Dr. Martinez to provide a written statement about my cognitive abilities. I even had Harold arrange for a formal mental competency evaluation, knowing it would be crucial evidence if Scarlett tried to claim I wasn't capable of making decisions about my own property. The evaluating psychologist, Dr. Sarah Kim, spent 3 hours testing my memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity. Her report concluded that I demonstrated exceptional cognitive function for any age group and showed no signs of impairment in judgment, memory, or executive functioning. 2 weeks after my meeting with Harold, I had assembled a comprehensive case that documented systematic financial abuse, fraud, and an organized conspiracy to steal my property. I had established my complete mental competency and gathered evidence of their deception that would hold up in any courtroom. Most importantly, I had emotionally prepared myself for the war I was about to wage. On the evening before our court date, I sat in my bedroom reviewing all the documents one final time. Scarlett's voice drifted through the walls as she talked on the phone about their upcoming Tahoe vacation, making final arrangements for her sister's parents to house-sit my home while I stayed behind to supervise. She still believed she was orchestrating the perfect plan to marginalize me further, while enjoying a family vacation funded by my generosity. She had no idea that in less than 12 hours, a judge would be signing an order requiring both her and Andrew to vacate my property. Within 48 hours, tomorrow, the woman who had suggested I sleep in the shed would discover exactly who held the real power in this situation, and I was finally ready to show her. The morning arrived gray and foggy, typical for Mendocino in late June, but I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in over a year. I was up at 5, dressed in my best navy suit, and sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee when Harold called at 7:30. "Elena, we're all set for 9 a.m., he said, his voice crisp and professional. "Judge Morrison has reviewed the preliminary documents and she's prepared to issue the emergency order. Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for months," I replied. "I just didn't know it yet." After we hung up, I continued my morning routine exactly as I had for the past 2 weeks. I made breakfast, read the local paper, and prepared a fresh pot of coffee. When Scarlett emerged from the master bedroom at 8:15, wrapped in the silk robe I'd bought her for Christmas, I greeted her with the same pleasant smile I'd been wearing like armor. "Good morning, Elena," she said, pouring herself coffee. "I'm so excited about today. The vacation rental confirmation came through last night, and Ivy's parents should be here around noon to get settled before we leave for Tahoe tomorrow." Tomorrow? They still believed they were leaving for a week at Lake Tahoe while I stayed behind to babysit strangers in my own home. "That's nice, dear," I said, folding my newspaper. "I have some errands to run this morning, but I should be back around lunchtime." "Perfect timing," Scarlett said, already scrolling through her phone. Bruce and Delilah can meet you then, and you can show them around. Explain where everything is. They're such lovely people. You'll adore them. Bruce and Delilah, who would be arriving to house-sit a home they would never set foot in, Andrew, appeared 20 minutes later, grabbing a travel mug of coffee and barely acknowledging my presence. Over the past 2 weeks, our interactions had dwindled to polite nods and brief pleasantries. It was as if he'd already written me off as an obstacle to navigate around rather than a mother to engage with. "See you tonight, Mom," he said, pausing at the kitchen door. "Scarlett's sister should be here with her kids around 6 for dinner before we all head out tomorrow." A farewell dinner. How fitting. I watched them both leave, Andrew to his insurance office, Scarlett to her winery job, and felt nothing but cold determination. In 1 hour, I would be sitting across from a judge, presenting evidence that would change their lives forever. But first, I had one final task. I called the property management company that Scarlett had fraudulently contracted with. "This is Elena Campbell," I said when the manager answered. "I need to speak with you about the cottage rental arrangement that was made without my authorization." "Mrs. Campbell," the woman said, her voice immediately tense. "I've been hoping to hear from you. After our conversation last week, we've done some investigating, and we're very concerned about the documentation we received. What have you found?" "The power of attorney document appears to have been forged," she admitted. "We've consulted with our legal team, and they've advised us to terminate the rental agreement immediately and return all deposits to the prospective tenants." "Good," I said. "You'll also need to change the locks on the cottage and provide me with the only set of keys. Can you have that done this morning?" "Absolutely. We'll have a locksmith there within the hour." "And one more thing," I added. "I'll need written documentation of all communications you had with Scarlett Thomas, including copies of the forged documents she provided." By 8:45, I was sitting in Harold's office, reviewing the final details of our strategy. The emergency order was straightforward, but comprehensive. Andrew and Scarlett had 48 hours to vacate the premises, were prohibited from removing any items that could be considered part of the property, and were banned from returning without written permission from me or my legal representative. "The judge will also be issuing a temporary restraining order," Harold explained, "preventing them from contacting you directly for at least 30 days. All communication will need to go through my office." At 9 o'clock sharp, we walked into Judge Morrison's courtroom. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every variation of family dysfunction imaginable. "Mrs. Campbell," she said, reviewing the documents we'd submitted, "I've read through your petition and supporting evidence. This appears to be a clear case of financial exploitation and property abuse. Before I issue this order, I need to ask you directly, are you certain you want to proceed with removing your son from your property?" "Your Honor," I said, standing, as Harold had instructed. "My son chose to stand by while his wife systematically dismantled my life and planned to steal my property. This isn't about family disagreement. It's about preventing theft and protecting my rights as a property owner." Judge Morrison nodded and signed the emergency order. "The respondents have 48 hours from the time they're served to vacate the property. Sheriff's deputies will serve the papers this afternoon." Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not happy, exactly, but free. Like I'd been carrying a massive weight and had finally been given permission to set it down. I drove home slowly, taking the scenic route along the coast. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I could see the locksmith's van at the cottage. Perfect timing. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing the new cottage keys, when I heard voices in the front yard. Through the window, I could see an older couple standing beside a loaded SUV, looking confused. Bruce and Delilah, I presumed, arriving right on schedule to house-sit a home they'd never be entering. I walked outside to meet them. "You must be Bruce and Delilah," I said pleasantly. "I'm Elena Campbell, the homeowner." "Oh, Elena," the woman said, her face lighting up with relief. "We were wondering where everyone was. Scarlett said you'd be here to show us around. I'm sure she did, I replied. Unfortunately, there's been a change of plans. The house sitting. Arrangement has been canceled. Their faces fell immediately. Canceled? Bruce asked. But Scarlett confirmed everything just yesterday. We drove 6 hours to get here. I understand this is inconvenient, I said, genuinely sympathetic to their situation. But I never authorized any house-sitting arrangement. My daughter-in-law made those plans without my knowledge or consent. I could see them processing this information, trying to reconcile what I was telling them with what Scarlett had promised. Is there somewhere we can call her? Delilah asked. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding? I'm sure she'll be in touch. With you very soon, I said. But for now, I'd suggest finding a hotel. The Mendocino Inn is lovely, and I'd be happy to call and see if they have availability. They exchanged glances, clearly realizing something was seriously wrong but too polite to push for details. After they left, I sat on my front porch and waited. Sheriff's deputies would be serving the eviction papers at Andrew's office and Scarlett's winery sometime in the next few hours. By evening, they would know that their carefully constructed plan had collapsed completely. The first call came at 2:17 p.m. Scarlett's name flashed on my phone screen, but I let it go to voicemail, as Harold had instructed. The second call came 3 minutes later, then a third, then a fourth. By 3 o'clock, she was calling every 5 minutes. I finally listened to the first voicemail at 3:30. Elena, what the hell is going on? Scarlett's voice was shrill, with panic. I just got served with some legal papers saying we have to move out in 48 hours. This has to be a mistake. Call me back immediately. The second message was angrier. Elena, I know you're there. Pick up the phone. We need to talk about this like adults. You can't just kick us out of our home without warning. Our home. Even in crisis, she couldn't acknowledge that it was my house. The third message revealed that Andrew had been served too. Elena, Andrew's lawyer says these papers are legitimate. How could you do this to your own son? We're family. We can work this out, but you need to call me back right now. I deleted all the messages without finishing them. At 4:15, I heard cars in the driveway. Through the window, I could see Andrew's sedan and Scarlett's SUV. They'd both left work early to confront me directly. I remained seated at my kitchen table as they burst through the front door, using keys that would be changed again before... Morning. Mom, what is this? Andrew demanded, waving the legal papers. His face was flushed, his hair disheveled. I'd never seen him look so rattled. It's exactly what it says, I replied calmly. You have 48 hours to vacate my property. Your property? Scarlett said, her voice rising to a near shriek. We live here. This is our home. You can't just throw us out on the street. Actually, I can, I said, standing up and facing them both directly. This is my house. I own it. You live here at my discretion, and I'm withdrawing that discretion. But why? Andrew asked, and for the first time in months, he sounded like my son rather than Scarlett's husband. What did we do wrong? I looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who was genuinely asking what he'd done wrong. Andrew, I said quietly, 3 weeks ago, your wife suggested that I sleep in the shed if I continued to interfere with her plans for my property. And you said nothing. The color drained from his face. You knew she was planning to rent out my cottage without my permission, take control of my finances, and position me as mentally incompetent so you could petition for guardianship. And you said nothing. Scarlett's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For over a year, you've both treated me like an inconvenient obstacle to your plans rather than a mother and property owner deserving of respect. So now I'm removing the obstacle permanently. But we have nowhere to go, Scarlett said. And for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely afraid. You should have thought of that, I replied, before you decided I should sleep in the shed. The 48 hours that followed were the most intense of my life. What I'd expected to be a straightforward eviction process turned into a psychological warfare campaign that revealed the true depths of Scarlett's desperation and manipulation skills. It started within an hour of our kitchen confrontation. After I'd calmly explained why they were being evicted, Andrew and Scarlett had retreated to the master bedroom for what sounded like heated, whispered arguments. Then the doorbell began ringing. The first visitor was Scarlett's sister Ivy, who arrived with her 2 young ones in tow, looking confused and concerned. "Elena," she said when I opened the door. "Scarlett called me crying, saying there's been some terrible misunderstanding about the house. She says you're trying to evict them illegally?" Behind her, I could see more cars pulling into my driveway. Scarlett had apparently activated her entire support network, calling in every favor and family connection she could think of. "There's no misunderstanding," I said calmly. "Andrew and Scarlett have 48 hours to vacate my property, as ordered by the court." "But Elena," Ivy pressed, "surely you don't mean to throw your own son out on the street. And what about the vacation we've all planned? My parents drove 6 hours to house sit for you." I noticed how she framed it, house sitting for me, as if I'd requested their services rather than having strangers imposed on my property without my consent. "I'm sorry you've been inconvenienced," I replied, "but arrangements were made without my knowledge or permission. I suggest you speak with Scarlett about why she led your family to believe otherwise." The next wave of visitors included Andrew's longtime friend Gary Clark, who'd apparently been told I was having some kind of mental health crisis. "Mrs. Campbell," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Andrew's really worried about you. He says you've been acting confused lately, making decisions that don't make sense. Maybe we should call your doctor." This was exactly what Harold had warned me about, the narrative of mental decline being used to discredit my authority over my own property. "Gary," I said, "I had a complete mental competency evaluation done last week. The psychologist found no impairment whatsoever. What you're seeing isn't confusion. It's a woman finally standing up for herself." But the most difficult visitor was my neighbor, Martha Wilson from my book club, who arrived looking genuinely concerned. "Elena, dear," she said, "people are saying, you've gone a bit, well, that you're not acting like yourself. Kicking Andrew out seems so unlike you." This hurt more than the others because Martha's concern was genuine, not manufactured by Scarlett's manipulation campaign. "Martha," I said, "you've known me for 8 years. In all that time, have I ever made an impulsive or irrational decision? Itao. Considered this. No, never. You're one of the most thoughtful people I know. Then perhaps you should consider that I'm not acting impulsively now either." I invited her in and showed her some of Harold's documentation. Not the most sensitive materials, but enough to demonstrate that this was a legal proceeding based on substantial evidence, not a confused woman's emotional reaction. Martha left, looking thoughtful rather than concerned, which I considered a victory. But Scarlett's most sophisticated attack came through Andrew himself. Around 8 o'clock that evening, he knocked on my bedroom door, a courtesy he hadn't shown in months. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft and familiar. "Just the 2 of us?" I let him in, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. "Mom, I know things have been strained between us," he began, sitting on the edge of my bed like he used to during our nighttime talks when he was a teenager. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about the shed comment. You're right. I should have said something. I should have defended you." This was what I'd been waiting to hear for months. An acknowledgement, an apology, a recognition of how his silence had hurt me. I've been so focused on keeping peace between you and Scarlett that I forgot my first responsibility is to you, my mother. "I'm sorry." The words I'd longed for, delivered with apparent sincerity. If this conversation had happened 6 months earlier, it might have changed everything. But now, After everything I'd discovered about their plans, after all the evidence I'd gathered of their systematic exploitation, Andrew's apology felt like another manipulation tactic rather than genuine remorse. "Andrew," I said carefully, "if you're truly sorry, if you truly understand what's been happening, then you'll respect the court order and vacate the property." His face changed immediately. The soft vulnerability disappeared, replaced by frustrated calculation. "But Mom, we have nowhere to go. We can't find an apartment in 48 hours. And what about all our stuff? Our furniture, our clothes, everything we've built here? Our stuff? Our furniture? In my house, purchased with my money, arranged to my preference but gradually taken over by their aesthetic choices. You've had over a year to build something," I replied. "You chose to build it at my expense rather than through your own efforts. That's not fair," he said, his voice taking on the petulant tone I remembered from his teenage years. "We contributed to this household. Scarlett cooked, cleaned, made the place beautiful. With my money, in my house, while systematically isolating me from my own life," I countered. "That's not contribution, Andrew. That's occupation." The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Andrew's mask of contrition slipped completely, revealing the same entitled attitude that had allowed him to stand by while his wife dismantled my dignity. "You're really going to destroy our family over this?" he asked, standing up abruptly. "You're going to choose some power trip over your own son?" "I'm choosing self-respect over enabling abuse," I replied. "If that destroys our family, then our family was already broken." He stormed out, slamming the door with a force that rattled the windows. The next morning brought escalated tactics. I woke to find my car blocked in the driveway by Scarlett's SUV, positioned so I couldn't leave without asking them to move it. When I knocked on the master bedroom door to request access to my own driveway, Scarlett emerged with red, swollen eyes and a tissue clutched in her hand. "Elena," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I've been awake all night thinking about this. I know I've made mistakes, but please don't punish Andrew for my failures." It was a masterful performance. The woman who had suggested I sleep in she'd was now positioning herself as the penitent daughter-in-law, willing to take responsibility to save her husband. "I'll move out," she continued, "if that's what you want. But please don't make Andrew choose between his wife and his mother. Let me be the bad guy here." But I'd seen too much, recorded too many conversations, gathered too much evidence of their joint planning to be swayed by this sudden martyrdom. "Scarlett," I said, "you and Andrew made your choices together. You'll face the consequences together." Her tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of cold fury I'd never seen before. "You stubborn old woman," she hissed, dropping all pretense. "You'd rather be right than happy. You'd rather win than have a family." "No," I replied calmly. "I'd rather have dignity than be stolen from by people who think kindness equals weakness." The final assault came that afternoon, just 6 hours before their eviction deadline. A car pulled into my driveway, and out stepped a woman in a professional suit carrying a briefcase. "Mrs. Campbell?" she said when I answered the door. "I'm Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a geriatric psychiatrist. Your family has expressed concerns about your mental state and has asked me to conduct an evaluation." This was Scarlett's nuclear option, bringing in a mental health professional to assess my competency, hoping to find evidence that could delay or invalidate the eviction order. "Dr. Hayes," I said, "I appreciate your concern, but I had a complete mental competency evaluation done just 2 weeks ago. The results are on file with my attorney." I showed her Dr. Kim's report, which clearly established my cognitive function as exceptional. Dr. Hayes reviewed the document, then looked up at me with professional embarrassment. "Mrs. Campbell, I think I've been misled about the nature of this situation. This evaluation is completely current and thorough. There's no medical basis for questioning your decision-making capacity." She left without conducting any assessment, but not before I heard her speaking firmly to Scarlett in the driveway about inappropriate use of mental health resources and potential ethical violations. At exactly 47 hours after the court order was served, with 1 hour remaining on their deadline, Andrew and Scarlett began loading boxes into their cars. They worked in silence, making multiple trips to pile belongings into every available space in their vehicles. I watched from the kitchen window, feeling neither satisfaction nor sadness, just a profound sense of completion. As they loaded the last boxes, Scarlett looked directly at me through the kitchen window. Even from that distance, I could see the hatred in her eyes. Not the hurt of someone who'd been wronged, but the rage of someone whose carefully constructed plan had been thoroughly defeated. At 5:47 p.m. on Friday evening, with 13 minutes to spare before their legal deadline, Andrew and Scarlett drove away from my property for the last time. The house felt different immediately. Not empty, peaceful. For the first time in over a year, every room belonged to me again. The silence in my house that first evening was profound. Not the oppressive quiet of loneliness, but the peaceful stillness of a space finally allowed to breathe. I walked through each room slowly, like someone revisiting a childhood home after decades away, reacquainting myself with spaces that had been mine all along, but had somehow stopped feeling that way. The master bedroom felt enormous without their belongings cluttering every surface. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the bed where I'd slept peacefully for years before being relegated to my old room like an unwelcome guest. Tomorrow, I decided, I would move my things back where they belonged. But tonight, I had something more important to do. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Harold's number. "Elena," he answered on the first ring. "How are you holding up?" "Surprisingly well," I said, settling into my favorite reading chair, the one Scarlett had banished to the guest room because it didn't match her aesthetic vision. They left with 13 minutes to spare. No drama, no final confrontations, just packed up and drove away. "That's probably for the best," Harold said. "Clean breaks usually heal better than prolonged conflicts. Have you thought about what comes next?" What came next? For over a year, I'd been living in reactive mode, responding to one manipulation after another, accommodating one demand after another. The idea of proactively planning my own life felt almost foreign. I think I need some time to remember who I am when I'm not being systematically undermined, I said. Harold chuckled. That sounds like the healthiest thing you could do. But Elena, there's something we should discuss. The restraining order prevents them from contacting you directly, but they could still try to approach mutual friends or neighbors to get messages to you. And there's always the possibility they might challenge the eviction legally. Do they have grounds to challenge it? None whatsoever. You followed every legal requirement, and the evidence of their behavior is overwhelming. But desperate people sometimes make irrational choices. Just be prepared for the possibility that this isn't completely over. After we hung up, I made myself a simple dinner, the first meal in over a year that I'd prepared without considering anyone else's preferences, dietary restrictions, or elaborate expectations. Just a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, eaten at my kitchen table while reading a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. It was perfect. That night, I slept better than I had in over a year. I woke naturally at sunrise, without an alarm, without the anxiety that had become my constant companion. For the first few minutes, I lay in bed trying to identify what felt different, then realized I wasn't bracing myself for the day's manipulations and demands. I was free to simply live my life. The first few days established a rhythm I'd forgotten I was capable of. I woke when my body felt rested, made coffee without worrying about noise levels, read the newspaper cover to cover without someone suggesting I hurry up so they could use the table. I cooked meals I enjoyed, watched television programs I found interesting, and went to bed when I felt tired, rather than when someone else decided I should retreat to my room. On the third day, I walked through my garden for the first time in months without someone commenting on what needed to be changed, updated or monetized. The tomatoes I'd planted in spring were finally ripening. The roses I'd tended for years were blooming magnificently despite being neglected during my months of domestic servitude. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, waiting patiently for my attention to return. I spent that afternoon in the guest cottage, seeing it clearly for the first time since Scarlett had begun her rental scheme. It was a charming space, cozy but not cramped, with good natural light and a peaceful view of the garden. I'd originally planned to convert it into an art studio once I fully retired, but that dream had been shelved when Andrew and Scarlett moved in and began treating every aspect of my property as their personal resource. Now, standing in the empty cottage with sunlight streaming through the windows, I could envision it again. An easel by the large window, canvases stacked along one wall, shelves for supplies, a comfortable chair for when I needed to step back and study my work. For the first time in over a year, I felt excited about the future rather than anxious about surviving the present. That evening, I called my book club president, Martha Wilson. "Elena," she said, her voice warm with relief. "I've been thinking about you constantly since our conversation. How are you managing?" "Better than I expected," I said honestly. "Martha, I owe you an apology. I should have told you what was really happening months ago, instead of letting you think I was becoming antisocial." "Oh, honey, you don't owe me anything. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to acknowledge that your own family was taking advantage of you. We talked for over an hour, the longest conversation I'd had with a friend in months without someone interrupting or suggesting I wrap up the call. Martha filled me in on book club discussions I'd missed, community events I'd been absent from, and the general concern people had felt about my withdrawal from activities I'd previously enjoyed. "We all noticed the change," she said gently, "but no one wanted to pry. Looking back, I wish we'd been more persistent about staying connected." "It wouldn't have mattered," I assured her. "I was so deep in the pattern of accommodation that I probably would have made excuses and pushed you away. Sometimes you have to hit bottom before you're ready to climb back up." The next morning brought my first real test. I was having coffee on the front porch when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. For a moment, my heart raced, thinking Andrew and Scarlett had returned despite the legal order. But the woman who got out was Scarlett's mother, Delilah Edwards. Watched her approach, noting the nervous way she clutched her purse and the uncertain expression on her face. This was clearly not a casual visit. "Elena," she said when she reached the porch steps, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I know, things have been difficult." "Hello, Delilah," I replied calmly. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to apologize," she said, her words coming out in a rush, "for the house-sitting arrangement, for showing up without really understanding the situation. Scarlett told us you'd invited us to stay, and we never questioned it." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but saw only genuine embarrassment and concern. "I appreciate that," I said. "Would you like to sit down?" She climbed the porch steps and settled into the chair beside mine, looking older and more tired than I remembered from the wedding. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Was she lying to us about other things too?" This was delicate territory. Whatever had happened between Scarlett and me, Delilah was still her mother. "What specifically are you concerned about?" I asked. "The money," she said quietly. "She told us you were helping them financially because you wanted to, because you enjoyed having family around and liked contributing to their future. But some things she said this week, after the eviction, they don't match up with what she told us before." I chose my words carefully. "Delilah, I did help them financially. Quite a bit, actually, but it wasn't because I offered. It was because they asked repeatedly for various emergencies and expenses that somehow never ended." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. She's been telling people you've been having memory problems, getting confused about money, and making poor decisions. But talking to you now, you seem as sharp as ever. I had a complete mental competency evaluation done, I said. The results are on file with my lawyer. There are no memory problems or cognitive issues. Delilah sat quietly for a moment, staring at her hands. I'm afraid my daughter has become someone I don't recognize, she said finally. The way she's been talking about you this week, the anger and resentment, it's not how I raised her. People reveal who they really are when they can't get what they want, I said gently. Sometimes that's painful for everyone involved. She stood to leave, then turned back to me. Elena, I know I have no right to ask this, but if there's ever a chance for reconciliation with Andrew, he's a good man who made bad choices. Don't write him off completely. After she left, I sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about her words. Andrew was a good man who made bad choices. Perhaps that was true. But good people who consistently make bad choices when it matters most aren't that different from bad people in terms of the damage they inflict. And I was finally at a place in my life where I valued my peace more than I valued the potential for other people's redemption. That realization didn't make me sad. It made me feel wise. 3 months after Andrew and Scarlett's departure, I learned that word travels fast in small communities, especially when the story involves family drama and property disputes. What I hadn't expected was how the narrative would evolve, or how my decision to stand up for myself would ripple through our little town in ways I never could have anticipated. The first indication came during my weekly grocery shopping at Henderson's Market, where I'd been shopping for over a decade. Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, approached me in the produce section with the cautious expression of someone unsure whether they were talking to a victim or a villain. "Elena, dear," she said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but people have been talking about what happened with Andrew and Scarlett. Some folks are saying you threw them out over a minor disagreement." I selected a particularly nice tomato from the display, taking my time to respond. This was exactly what Harold had warned me might happen. Scarlett's version of events spreading through the community before the truth could catch up. "Mrs. Henderson," I said calmly, "I removed them from my property because they were systematically stealing from me and planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could take ownership of my house." Her eyes widened. "Stealing? But Scarlett always seemed so sweet, so devoted to family." "The sweetest manipulators are often the most dangerous ones," I replied. "They make you complicit in your own exploitation." That conversation apparently started something, because over the next few weeks, I found myself having similar discussions with neighbors, shopkeepers, and longtime acquaintances. Each person had heard a different version of the story, usually casting me as either a confused elderly woman who'd misunderstood normal family dynamics, or a bitter, controlling mother who couldn't let her adult son live his own life. But something interesting happened as I calmly presented the facts to each person who approached me. The story began to change in the community consciousness. People started remembering things they'd noticed but hadn't understood at the time. Martha Wilson mentioned it at our next book club meeting, which I'd finally started attending again. "You know, Elena," she said as we discussed our monthly selection. Looking back, there were signs. I remember seeing Scarlett at the bank several times, always with folders of paperwork, looking very businesslike. At the time, I thought it was nice that she was helping you with financial matters. She was helping herself to financial matters, I corrected gently. Other members chimed in with their own observations. Someone had seen Scarlett showing people through my cottage, describing rental terms and availability. Another had overheard her at the post office, redirecting my mail to a P.O. box I'd never authorized. The pieces of a larger pattern were becoming visible to people who hadn't seen the whole picture before. The most significant community response came from an unexpected source, Dr. Martinez, my longtime physician. He called me one afternoon with concern in his voice. "Elena, I've been hearing some troubling things around town about your cognitive health. Someone's been suggesting that I've documented memory problems or signs of dementia in your medical records." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What exactly have you heard?" "Scarlett Thomas called my office last week, claiming to be your authorized representative. She requested copies of your medical records, saying the family needed them for care planning purposes. When my nurse explained she'd need written authorization from you, Scarlett became quite insistent, claiming there were documented concerns about your mental capacity. Dr. Martinez, you examined me just 4 months ago. What did you find?" "Elena, you're one of the sharpest patients I have, regardless of age. Your cognitive function, memory, and reasoning abilities are all excellent. If someone's claiming otherwise, based on my medical opinion, they're lying." This revelation was both validating and terrifying. Even after the eviction, Scarlett was still working to build a case for my mental incompetence, presumably hoping to challenge my legal actions or position herself for future opportunities. "I think you should know," Dr. Martinez continued, "that I'll be documenting this conversation and making it clear in your file that any claims about cognitive decline are completely unfounded." 2 weeks later, I received a call from Harold that confirmed my worst suspicions. "Elena, we've intercepted some concerning communications. Scarlett has been contacting legal aid services, claiming she's concerned about elder abuse, with you as the abuser and Andrew as the victim." I almost laughed at the audacity. "She's claiming I'm abusing Andrew? She's telling people that you've financially manipulated him, isolated him from his support system, and are using your property ownership to control his life. She's also suggesting that your mental health has deteriorated to the point where you're making irrational decisions about family relationships. Can she make that stick?" "Not with the evidence we have," Harold assured me. "But it shows she hasn't given up. She's trying to build a case that could potentially challenge the eviction or set the stage for a guardianship petition with Andrew as the petitioner instead of her." This information forced me to confront an uncomfortable reality. My decision to reclaim my life hadn't ended the conflict. It had simply moved it to a different battlefield. But I also discovered that I had more allies than I'd realized. Word of Scarlett's continued schemes had apparently reached other members of the community, and people were beginning to take sides based on their own experiences and observations. Turning point came during a community meeting about local property taxes. I'd been attending these meetings for years, but this was my first since the eviction. I wasn't sure what kind of reception to expect. To my surprise, several people approached me with expressions of support and even admiration. "Elena," said Tom Rodriguez, who owned the hardware store downtown, "I heard about what you went through with your daughter-in-law. My wife and I dealt with something similar with her brother's family a few years back. It takes real courage to stand up to family manipulation." Others shared similar stories. Adult children who'd moved back home and gradually taken over, in-laws who'd insinuated themselves into property decisions, elderly parents who'd been systematically isolated and exploited. My story had apparently resonated with people who'd witnessed or experienced similar situations. But the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source: a young woman named Sarah Chen, who worked as a social worker specializing in elder abuse cases. "Ms. Campbell," she said, approaching me after the meeting, "I hope you don't mind, but I've heard about your situation through professional channels. What you did, documenting everything, building a legal case, protecting your assets, that's exactly what we advise people in your situation to do. You've become something of an inspiration in our field." An inspiration? I'd never thought of myself that way. But Sarah explained that most elder abuse cases involving family members never reach resolution because the victims are too ashamed, too isolated, or too emotionally manipulated to take action. "You're proof that it's possible to fight back successfully," she said. "We've started using your case as an example in our training programs, obviously without using names, to show people that strategic documentation and legal action can work. This conversation led to something I'd never expected: requests to share my story more formally. Sarah asked if I'd be willing to speak at a conference about elder abuse prevention. A local women's group invited me to discuss boundary setting in family relationships. Even the regional library system asked if I'd participate in a program about financial literacy for seniors. Each speaking opportunity forced me to articulate lessons I was still learning myself. But the process of explaining what had happened, why I'd tolerated it for so long, and how I'd finally found the strength to fight back, helped solidify my own understanding of the experience. The most rewarding responses came from other women who'd heard my story and recognized elements of their own lives. Some were dealing with similar family exploitation. Others had controlling spouses or manipulative adult children. A few were simply trapped in patterns of over-accommodation that were slowly eroding their sense of self. One woman, Betty Martinez, approached me after a library presentation with tears in her eyes. "Elena, listening to you tonight. My daughter and her husband moved in with me 6 months ago after they lost their apartment. They were supposed to stay just until they got back on their feet, but now they're talking about renovating my house, making changes to suit their needs. They've started treating me like I'm the guest." I recognized the pattern immediately. "Betty, what does your gut tell you about their intentions?" "I think they've decided they like living rent-free better than getting their own place," she admitted. "But they're my family. How do I set boundaries without destroying relationships?" "The same way I did," I said gently. "By accepting that some relationships aren't worth preserving if they require you to sacrifice your dignity and autonomy." 6. Weeks later, Betty called to tell me she'd given her daughter and son-in-law a move-out deadline. They'd found their own apartment within 2 weeks, and their relationship, while strained, was ultimately more honest than it had been when built on exploitation. These conversations taught me that my experience wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of family manipulation that often goes unrecognized because we're taught that family loyalty should override personal boundaries. But they also taught me something else: that standing up for yourself doesn't just change your own life. It gives other people permission to do the same. By the end of those 3 months, I realized that my decision to evict Andrew and Scarlett had consequences far beyond reclaiming my own home. It had started conversations, challenged assumptions, and inspired other people to examine their own family dynamics more critically. Most importantly, it had established me not as a victim who'd been rescued, but as a woman who'd rescued herself, and that distinction, I was learning, made all the difference in how I saw myself and how others saw me too. 1 year after that devastating conversation where Scarlett suggested I sleep in the shed, I stood in my transformed cottage studio, brush in hand, adding finishing touches to a painting I'd been working on for weeks. The canvas showed my garden in full bloom, vibrant roses, heavy tomato vines, and morning sunlight filtering through the oak tree that had witnessed my entire journey from victim to victor. It was my first completed painting in over 15 years, and I'd never felt more proud of anything I'd created. The cottage had become everything I'd dreamed it could be. Natural light streamed through windows that were finally clean and unobstructed. My easel occupied the perfect spot for morning painting sessions. Shelves lined the walls, filled with art supplies I'd been accumulating with the joy of someone, rediscovering a long-lost passion. A comfortable reading chair sat in the corner, surrounded by books I was finally free to read without interruption. This was what my money had bought me. Not designer handbags or elaborate vacations or someone else's vision of home improvement, but space for my own creativity and peace for my own thoughts. The transformation wasn't just physical. Over the past year, I'd rebuilt my life with the same methodical precision I'd once used to plan my legal strategy. But this time I was building toward joy rather than defense. I'd reconnected with friends I'd been gradually isolated from, joining not just my book club, but also a hiking group for seniors and a community garden project. I'd started volunteering again at the animal shelter, finding deep satisfaction in caring for creatures who appreciated kindness without trying to exploit it. Most surprisingly, I'd begun dating. Nothing serious, just coffee meetings and casual. Dinners with a widowed gentleman named Walter Kim, who'd attended one of my presentations about elder abuse. He was 10 years older than me, financially independent, and refreshingly direct about his intentions, which were simply to enjoy good company without drama or agenda. "Elena," he'd said after our third coffee date, "I'm too old for games and too comfortable to need rescuing or managing. I just enjoy your conversation and would like to continue having it regularly." It was exactly the kind of straightforward, respectful approach I'd learned to value above all else. But the most significant change was internal. I'd developed what I called my manipulation radar, an ability to recognize the early warning signs of people who saw kindness as weakness and generosity as opportunity. The subtle pressure to make decisions quickly, the casual assumption of authority over my resources, the gradual isolation from support systems, the false concern about my capabilities when I resisted their suggestions, the positioning of reasonable boundaries as selfishness or cruelty. I'd learned to spot these patterns within days rather than enduring them for months or years, and I'd developed the confidence to address them immediately and decisively. Just last month, a new neighbor had knocked on my door with what seemed like a friendly request to borrow my lawnmower, but something about the way he'd surveyed my property, commented on how large it was for just one person, and suggested that I probably had more space than I needed, triggered my internal alarms. The old Elena might have lent the lawnmower, then found herself gradually providing more and more help until I was essentially maintaining his yard, while he found increasingly elaborate reasons why he couldn't reciprocate or afford professional lawn care. The new Elena smiled politely and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't lend out my equipment. There's a hardware store downtown that rents mowers by the day." He'd looked surprised, then slightly annoyed, then had made a comment about unfriendly neighbors. But he hadn't asked for anything else, and I'd felt nothing but satisfaction at maintaining a boundary from the very first interaction. This was the gift my ordeal with Andrew and Scarlett had given me, the ability to protect myself before damage was done rather than after. 6 months ago, I'd received a letter forwarded through Harold's office. Andrew had written to say he was getting divorced and wanted to rebuild our relationship now that the source of conflict was gone. He explained that he'd finally understood how Scarlett had manipulated the situation and wanted another chance to be the son I'd raised him to be. I'd read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. The Andrew who had stood silently, while his wife suggested I sleep in a shed, was the same Andrew asking for reconciliation now. His willingness to throw Scarlett under the bus to preserve his potential inheritance showed me exactly who he was when his interests were at stake. Some bridges once burned aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some relationships once broken by betrayal can't be repaired with apologies. And some people only value you when they realize they might need something from you later. I'd learned to be at peace with all of these realities. Last week, I'd received the most meaningful validation of my journey. Sarah Chen, the social worker who'd first approached me about speaking at conferences, called with an update that brought tears to my eyes. "Elena, I wanted you to know that we've had 17 people contact our office in the past 6 months, saying they heard your story and it gave them the courage to take action in their own situations. 17 families have been preserved from financial exploitation because you were willing to share what happened to you. 17 people. 17 families who wouldn't have to endure what I'd endured because I'd been willing to speak openly about manipulation, boundaries, and the courage required to choose self-respect over family peace. There's something else," Sarah had continued. "We're putting together a resource guide for elder abuse prevention, and we'd like to include your story, with your permission, of course, as a case study in successful resistance to family manipulation." I'd agreed immediately. If my experience could help other people recognize the signs of systematic exploitation before it was too late, then every moment of pain I'd endured would have served a purpose beyond my own liberation. That evening, I'd sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint my garden in shades of gold and crimson. The same porch where I'd once felt like a prisoner in my own home now felt like a throne from which I surveyed a kingdom I'd fought to reclaim. I thought about all the women who'd approached me after my presentations, tearfully recognizing elements of their own lives in my story. The daughters-in-law who were slowly taking over their elderly relatives' homes, the adult children who'd moved back in temporarily and decided to stay permanently, the spouses who'd gradually assumed control over joint assets and decisions. The pattern was always the same: gradual erosion of autonomy disguised as care, financial exploitation rationalized as family support, and isolation from friends and activities framed as concern for well-being. But I'd also learned that the solution was always the same: documentation, legal protection, professional support, and the courage to choose personal dignity over other people's comfort. Most importantly, I'd learned that you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. That family relationships built on exploitation aren't worth preserving. That being alone is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who see you as an ATM, a service provider, or an obstacle to their desires. At 65, I'd finally learned the most valuable lesson of my life: that true strength isn't the ability to endure mistreatment. It's the wisdom to refuse it from the very beginning. I'd spent decades teaching literature to teenagers, helping them understand stories about characters who faced moral choices and defining moments. But it wasn't until I faced my own defining moment that I truly understood what courage looked like. It looked like an elderly woman sitting across from a judge, calmly presenting evidence of her own systematic abuse by the people she'd loved most. It looked like someone choosing legal action over family harmony because some harmony isn't worth the price it demands. It looked like me, reclaiming my life one boundary at a time and discovering that the woman I'd always been was strong enough to save herself. As I finished my tea and prepared to go inside to my peaceful, beautiful, completely my own home, I whispered a promise to the woman I'd been a year ago. You don't have to sleep in the shed. You never did. This house is yours. This life is yours. And you are worth fighting for. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to accept less than you deserve. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the recognition that you deserve so much more than you've been settling for. That recognition changed everything for me. And it can change everything for you too. All it takes is the courage to say, this is my property, this is my life, and I deserve respect in both. Everything else follows from there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.